before we came here in that capacity, we came here as kings. And we came to Central America as kings. How many of you know of the Olmec civilization? The Olmec civilization. Later on in the year, I'm going to contact Ms. Johnson, and I'm going to ask her to talk to the brothers and sisters here at the head table and others in the Afro-Costa Rican community, because I'm going to be going around to all our people in the region to pull together funds to do a documentary on the Olmecs. What is it about these Olmecs? Do you know that just north of here in Mexico, they found 60 gigantic stone heads. 60 gigantic stone heads that were so heavy that over the last few hundred years, they sunk into the ground and actually had to be excavated and brought back up. They are now in different places in Mexico, at museums and so on. All these 16 heads, brothers and sisters, look exactly like you and me. And all of them were found facing east towards the west coast of Africa. Some of them had cane rows, brothers and sisters. Who wears cane rows, brothers and sisters? They had Egyptian helmets and earrings. And you know some of our brothers today still like to wear all kind of fancy earrings and things. So not much has changed. So this denial of historical truth is a way of absolving those who rule of their crimes and supplying their speeches with alibis. Why am I saying that? Because, again, going back to what I said about universalism, if the practice is equality, equal treatment and so on, why is it that you have this crazy imbalance between some groups and others? You have to come up with some kind of story to make that a reality. Because if it is that everybody contributed something to civilization, how come some people now don't look like they, suffer poverty and their communities have social malaise and crime and families are breaking down and other groups are thriving? How did that happen? Well, the way they do that is to try to separate opulence from plunder. The opulence of the European cities from the plunder of the continent of Africa, of its people and its resources. Wealth must be rendered innocent of poverty. The wealth of the great capitalists with their massive skyscrapers had nothing to do with the impoverishment of people all across the globe. The European wealth of the Industrial Revolution is detached from slavery and the slave trade. And I want to stick a pin here for 1 second. Because Dr. Eric Williams from Trinidad, in his great book, Capitalism and Slavery, made the point that it was the wealth, the surplus capital, that was raised on the back of 350 years of our servitude, that was used to fund the Industrial Revolution, which gave rise to the super development of Europe. So, according to Walter Rodney, the super development of Europe was built on the underdevelopment of Africa and its people. And I'll tell you something. In Trinidad, almost every 2 years, you have a conference on Dr. Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. And every 2 years, the brightest, most brilliant economists from across the world come down to the University of the West Indies to debate this very point. They need to break this connection. Wealth, as I said, must be innocent of poverty. But let me tell you, the reason they have to come back every 2 years is because they failed every 2 years to break the connection. So we give Brother Williams a round of applause for his contribution. So once you deny historical truth, though, it leads into something else. It leads into theories of racial inferiority. Because what you're saying is that these people didn't do anything, they didn't contribute anything, and so they're in this position of inferiority because they are, as I said, biologically inferior. So scientists now begin to think, why is it? What is it that makes black people less than white people? And they start coming up with a bunch of pseudoscientific ideas. And this kind of pseudoscience flourished in the 19th century. And one of the examples I gave yesterday was the example of phrenology, the science of being able to look at the shape of a person's head and where they have bumps to decide if they are moral or immoral or bright or intelligent or foolish or dunce or criminal-minded or what have you. That was a real science back in the 19th century. Notions of the size of your head, the size of your cranial capacity. And in fact, there is an example in Costa Rica, and I'll give you it now. In 1986, in La Repubblica, in a newspaper called La Repubblica, a writer argues that whites are more intelligent because they have larger brains. This is indicative of the pseudoscience of the 19th century. And to tell you how foolish this is, go back to your days in primary school, when you first went to school. Remember that classroom, when you looked around for the first time, and the sizes of the heads of the different boys, particularly for the boys, because our parents in the African community like to give us that bald head cut. So you can see a man's head. The first thing you see is a man's head, right? And the Rasta man later on he grows here, but at first they used to give you that bald head, right?
Yes.
Right? So when you go into class and you look around now, you say, oh cool, look at the size of that man's head. That man must have brains, boy. He must be bright. I can't compete with him. But when you check it at the end of the term, he might be the person to come last in class. The big head fella. But this, and I mean, this is so straightforward. But this is the kind of science, this was what was presented as science back in the 19th century. In fact, to use the scientific terms, they created something called the cephalic index, which when it reached its height, somewhere close to the beginning of the 20th century, there were 2,000 measurements of the skull to check cranial capacity, to decide who had a bigger brain space, and therefore who was smarter. And so they came up with all kinds of mad science to try to explain why we were inferior and they were superior. And the way it worked out, there's no maths in the whole thing. As far as they were concerned, the European was the prototypic Adamic man, the first man, because they were working with the Bible. And they were thinking in terms of the Garden of Eden. And so there was a creation. And somebody was created in the likeness and image of God. And that was Adam. And therefore that was white man. And then you move away gradually to the brown man, to the red man, and then down to the black man, who is the furthest away from the white man. And so therefore what you have in their minds was a devolution. And I'll tell you how this works out. So let me tell you how they fool themselves into thinking rubbish. So after they come up with these theories of inferiority, naturally they're looking for the Garden of Eden where? In Europe, correct?
Yeah.
Right? So they start digging all over the place in France, in Britain, in Belgium. They're actually running a race with each other. All this time, you and me, our grandparents on the plantation. Some of us were free already, as in late 19th century. But I'll tell you, some of us were still on the plantation. In places like Cuba, in Brazil, while they were digging helter-skelter to try to find who was really where the Garden of Eden was in Europe. Right? All of a sudden, one or two European scientists decide, hey, let's go across to Africa. Let's just see what they have over there. In Ethiopia, they find, oh shoot, skeletons older than anything they have in Europe by far. So they keep digging in Africa, and every time they dig, they find something even older. Another human being older. So they know they're near the Garden of Eden when they're in Ethiopia. So they start to get stressed out. So a man by the name of Arthur Keith, he decides, you know what I'm going to do? I know that the Garden of Eden is in Europe. We can't find it, but I know it's there. So without having to actually find the real skeleton, what I will do is bury my own. So he take a man's head and a monkey jawbone, and he bury it in a layer of soil he thought would be older than the skeletons in Africa. And then you know what? He dig it up himself and he said, oh God, look what I find. The original man is right here in England. This is the Garden of Eden. And that was in the 1920s. Look it up on the internet. And do you know, when you read the history, the very first European scholar to go in and see this human head with this monkey jawbone say, oh God, that don't look real. That looking fake. But do you know that they all kept silent? And they let this myth go on right up into the 1950s. And Arthur Keith was knighted by the Queen for his discovery. And now today they have to let all that go. Because on top of just digging for skeletons, they can now check DNA. And the DNA science is irrefutable. The Garden of Eden is in Africa. Not something